226 Causeway Street is a building that was completed over 100 years ago as a bakery. In the late 90s, when it was proposed for redevelopment for residential condominiums, they saw it as an opportunity to wake up the North Station development area. Among the mitigation that was required for the additional height that the applicant called for, they wanted to include public amenities, which included public restrooms that would be accessible at reasonable hours, and then space for retail that was considered a public amenity at the time. Some of the amenities that have come in the form of mitigation for water permits have left these little treasures around the city. In this case, a little treasure really is knowing where you can find a public restroom.
There's a statement of the design intent that we developed for the courthouse, and it says, "This most beautiful site in Boston doesn't belong to the judges, doesn't belong to the lawyers, doesn't belong to the federal government, it belongs to the public." And that's the kind of framework that we tried to work ourselves through. We tend to think of a kind of Manichaean difference between public space, which is good, and private space, which is bad, and then there's something in between that we don't recognize, and that's our civic life. We just ignore it. And what we want to do is try to draw people into being engaged, or at least watching what goes on in one of the most important aspects of their life.
Lawn on D is part of the Massachusetts Convention Center Authority's Urban Renewal Initiative to activate this new innovation district in the South Boston neighborhood. And our contribution to that was Swing Time, which was a temporary installation that was part of Lawn on D. And so what it was a playscape where children and adults alike could come and play on these glowing swings that varied in sizes and really incentivized playing by changing colors based on the amount that people swung. So it was a really fun playscape, and it really attracted a diverse audience from not only the Innovation District, but also from around Greater Boston.
Here at Atlantic Wharf, we've just got an amazing amount of variety taking place. For this project, for sure, we have more creativity than any project I've ever seen or property that we own. Last year, we had 325 events here. It's just staggering to me to think that that many events are taking place here. Everything from our Brown Box Theater and our Fort Point Theater to exhibits by the BSA. And our customers that are in the office buildings, they walk through and they see all this and they're just fascinated by it. The lessons learned at Atlantic Wharf have been really several, but probably a couple come to mind. The first is, if you make a commitment, stick to it. And we made a commitment to the community that this was going to be a place where there was activities, that we were going to engage with the community. So the commitment is absolutely imperative.
I want to thank the videographer Duncan Lake and the entire communications team at the Boston Society of Architects for helping with that nice video, which I think abstracts some of the themes that we're going to be exploring tonight. Of course, not all of the public-private partnerships in our city have as happy endings as these. There are some privately operated public spaces that are poorly maintained and poorly managed, and there are others that are beautiful additions to our public realm, seemingly almost by coincidence. So tonight we're going to try to puzzle through some of these relationships, what works, what doesn't, and what we as architects and planners and citizens can do about it. I'm Renee Loth. I'm the editor of here earlier, Architecture Boston magazine. In this current issue, we dive into some of these questions, these knotty problems of who really owns our public spaces and the increasingly blurred lines between public and private in housing, transportation, workspaces, or learning spaces, public spaces, and parks. I commend you to the magazine. There are many copies around tonight, and there's some more in the gallery where we will be having a reception. If you like the magazine and you don't already, please subscribe. The program tonight will take about 90 minutes. My only role here now is to introduce our fabulous panel, and then we'll have a conversation for about 45 minutes, and then I'll come back and we can engage in some more discussion with all of you. I should note, and after this conversation here, we'll be having a reception, a private reception in the gallery to which you're all invited. I should note that this discussion is being recorded by the Forum Network, which is a joint project of WGBH, NPR, and PBS. If you signed up, and there's also information about continuing education credits at the table, but if you've signed up, we'll alert you when the video is available online. And now to our panel. I'm going to start the introductions with the woman who needs none. Vivian Lee, everybody knows her. She's the president of the Boston Harbor Association, a nonprofit public interest organization founded in 1973 by the League of Women Voters, something I did not know, and the Boston Shipping Association to promote a clean, alive, and accessible Boston Harbor. They actually promote a blend of climate-resilient private development with public access and amenities. Best known probably for shepherding the 40-mile harbor walk from Dorchester to East Boston. Vivian knows everything and everybody worth knowing in this field. She's an honorary member of the Boston Society of Architects and was the first person elected as a public member to serve on the board of the American Institute of Architects. Next, we have Don Briggs. Don is president of the Boston Office of Federal Realty Investment Trust. He is responsible for managing the Trust's entire East Coast pipeline of development, including several mixed-use projects and public-private endeavors. He has created developments, for example, in the Rockville Town Square in Maryland, and the more recently, the huge and transformative Assembly Row and Assembly Square Marketplace in Somerville. He is also the New England District Chair of the Urban Land Institute. And we're happy to have Gerald Caden. He is the Frank Backus Williams Professor of Urban Planning and Design at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. He wrote a book titled Privately Owned Public Space, The New York City Experience, in collaboration with the New York Planning Department and the Municipal Art Society of New York. And he also founded Advocates for Publicly Owned Private Space, a nonprofit organization. In this current issue of the magazine, he describes this work in New York, and he contrasts it, not always favorably, to the management of public but often hidden spaces here in Boston. Steve Cecil is the founding principal of the Cecil Group in Boston. He has 30 years of professional experience in urban design, planning, landscape architecture, and architecture. His practice is known especially for taking on planning and design challenges that are attentive to their cultural and community and environmental contexts. And more important, perhaps, he is a member of the editorial board of Architecture Boston magazine and the author in this issue of an excellent article on the unique history of the city's Chapter 91 development process along Boston Harbor. And now to our moderator, Matt Kiefer. He is a real estate lawyer and so much more at Gulston & Storrs, where he has a particular focus on advancing complex urban projects through the sometimes opaque permitting process through public agencies. He's also the chair of the Boston Municipal Research Bureau and president of Historic Boston. And he's taught at the urban planning program at Harvard's Graduate School of Design and also at MIT. He's written and spoken extensively on real estate and land use law and policy, including in several articles in Architecture Boston. So I'm going to turn it over to him now. I'll be back in 45. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Renee. We had the traveling mic here somewhere too, right? No? It walked off. Well, that's right. No, there we go. Thank you very much. Just in case I need it. For no, in case I need it later. Great. Good evening. Thanks for coming tonight. I'm Matt Kiefer. And Renee, thanks for that very generous introduction. I almost didn't recognize myself. I'm really looking forward to this panel. We have a terrific panel of, we have an advocate We have a developer, we have an academic, we have an author, a planning practitioner, and many people in the audience who are sort of involved in civic space in the city too. So this is a sort of a fraught subject, so we're now going to go into lockdown mode until we work it out, right? No, really, this is a fruitful subject for conversation. It's something that is, you know, particularly fraught, this blurry line between public and private space. So before we jump in, I want to just frame it a little bit, and frame it by maybe encapsulating a couple of centuries of urban history into 3 sentences as to kind of how we got to this moment that we're in. You know, the traditional way of building cities is the public sector builds public infrastructure, private parties fill the spaces in between. It's really simple. It has the virtue of great clarity, and it's not the way we do things anymore. Starting maybe in the mid-20th century, we actually started using public resources to promote private development. We treated private development in cities in the age of urban decline and urban renewal as something that actually justified public support, and started to blur that line a little bit. In a half century, we've sort of come full circle to, rather than private development being something that deserves public support, or consumes public subsidies, you might say, it's something that is expected to generate public benefits, at least in cities with healthy economies like Boston. This is the world we've been in for maybe 30 or 40 years now, evolving maybe starting in the 1970s and 80s into the world of exactions, which you know, is a word that basically connotes conditions attached to private development to provide, among other things, public benefits. And that's kind of the predicate for our panel today, is the world of exactions, which results in public amenities that are privately delivered, not always privately owned, but privately delivered. And it creates lots of issues. So let's start by, and we want to have a particular focus on the waterfront, where you know, the waterfront's an appropriate focus, not only because we're on the waterfront here this evening, but it obviously has very high amenity value. There's a very strong public interest in providing public facilities along the waterfront. And of course, we have an exaction vehicle called Chapter 91, the state waterfront licensing statute. So many of the examples of these spaces are along the waterfront. We're not going to exactly restrict ourselves to that, but a little bit of an emphasis on that today. So, and the format for this is I'm just going to ask our panelists some questions. They haven't prepared specific things. We've talked a little bit about the content of the panel, but really we're intending this to be a conversation. And as Renee said, we'll involve you in the conversation at the end as well. So I want to start by asking each of you, Vivian, we'll start with you and move this way. Give us an example of one of these semi-public spaces that works and why it works.
First of all, I don't think I'd exactly call it an exaction. I think that the state's Chapter 91 regulations have made possible the public amenities that we are all enjoying on this waterfront. And the reason that the developers have had to do the amenities is because they actually have proposed to have more dense development, higher development, sometimes less open space on their sites. For example, there was in the video that we saw a discussion by Brian Koop of Atlantic Wharf, where we are today. Because of the historic preservation requirements, this building was not able to meet its open space requirements that is traditional under Chapter 91 public trust doctrine, and also because of the fact that they want to be higher. So there was a mix of benefits on the inside of the building, and also this developer supported the park across the way at the Children's Museum. So I think actually when you look at a mix of things, this building is of course one that many of us love and treasure, but I also have to be candid. It took a lot of pushing of the developer in the beginning. There was no signage. Other than those of us who know, who are on the BSA's mailing list, the general public never would have known about the space on the ground floor or even about the gallery. To get the flags and the banners that you see up there took a long time. So I think this is an example that we can certainly start with in the discussion.
Good. Don?
Sure, I'll use Assembly Square as an example. We built a 6-acre public park on the Mystic River. If you'd been out there back in 2004 and 2005 when we actually bought that piece of real estate, you wouldn't even know the Mystic River existed. And the park actually was only about 4 acres. 2 acres was owned by the state, but it was being used for boat storage for a private yacht club. So the reason it worked is because we were able to sit down with the state, actually close a land swap in which we took the 2 acres that was outside of the Chapter 91 zone, currently used, public owned land, currently used for boat storage. We were able to add it to a 4-acre park and now create a 6-acre park within the Chapter 91 zone that made it economically viable for us to then make the improvements necessary of $2 to $3 million to actually make a park. Ultimately, we entered into a maintenance agreement with the state because we believe that we'll maintain our front door better than they will. So it's in our interest to make sure that that public park is maintained, is safe, is friendly. And as part of that, we negotiated a whole host of rights to program that space. So we have yoga in the park, we have various activities that happen there, music gets played, all sponsored by us and made possible because of the strong public-private partnership that we form with the state.
That's great. Yeah, Gerald, give us an example. We'll come back to some of the themes that each of you are, but I just want to get each of these examples out there first.
Post Office Square.
He rests his case.
Well, it's actually
What makes that so
controversial.
successful?
Look, everybody knows why it's successful. So if you've been to it, you understand. It has its controversies attached to it. There are purists who say, no, it's really not a pure public space, et cetera. It works in all of the traditional ways for the neighborhood, for the area. I don't know if it's an asset for the entire city of Boston, but it's certainly an asset for the downtown area, and it could be an asset for many others. But on a daily basis, obviously, it works wonderfully for the people who surround that area. End of story.
Steve?
Well, I think that I think that there are other dimensions or dimensions of this project that I might add to the points that you've made, Vivian, because some of the benefits that flowed from this development aren't actually on this site. There's a group called the Friends of the Fort Point Channel, which is funded by, in great part by the private property owners, of which, along the Fort Point Channel, of which this is one. And that organization has as its mission creating programming in, on, and around the water. So yoga classes that are provided around the edge of the water may not be at this building, but there's a kind of a shared responsibility that's building up through the way that the city of Boston is looking at its open space. So I think that when you look at the idea of bringing the public in a meaningful way into these places, the programming side of it is so important, and we have other examples of that. And again, plenty of room for controversy and discussion, but the Greenway is another example where the property owners around the edges are contributing substantially towards creating the kinds of programming that I get to enjoy because our offices are down here.
Yeah, that's great.
It's not a space, it's a use.
So we're going to get to some of the issues here, but I want to just start by talking a little bit about these successful spaces. And these are all, we have four examples now of spaces built by private parties that serve some valuable public function. Maybe they're not perfect, but they're certainly good. So what's the best way to say this? I mean, what values does this serve? Maybe some of this is a little bit obvious, but I just want to kind of get this out there. How did we get to this place of doing these, of asking private parties to build these great, or whatever, very serviceable, high-quality public spaces?
It's not just
what interest does it serve over having, the public sector do it?
But it's not just the private properties. I mean, whoever has waterfront properties, when you go to East Boston and
Well, but
you
each of the examples we talked about, right? I mean, yours with Atlantic Wharf back here,
well, just because
Assembly
we're starting
Square.
here. But I think about Pierce Park, Massport. I don't know if anyone here is from Massport. I mean, there isn't a more beautiful site. When you think about when this waterfront was being renovated under Kevin White, you know, Christopher Columbus Park, which started out as Waterfront Park. I mean, you know, Waterfront Park is the City of Boston Park. Pierce Park is Massport's park. I mean, you know, we have here others from that have been active, Boston Natural Areas Network, their efforts on the East Boston Greenway. I mean, we have a very unique city. You have the private sector, you have the public sector, you have not-for-profit organizations that have taken the lead. I mean, I think we're pretty special in the way that we approach it. So I don't think of it as an extraction. I think of it as the amenities that have made people want to come to this waterfront. And let's face it, the fact that there is open space, the fact that the harbor is clean because we collectively had to pay for it, has now driven up the prices and the real estate prices on this waterfront in an incredible way. So having these amenities actually makes it much more attractive. It does not make it less attractive for developers, right?
Well, so Don, let's talk about this. So, you know, I just want to
I'm sorry, was that an engage? You want me to respond?
Yes, why don't we engage?
Sure. I do think it's an extraction. I also agree with many of your points. I think that you had started the question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you got to be close to the mic, yeah.
You had started the question with how do we get here? I think we got here because we do have private property rights in America. And to a large degree, private property owners should and could and do control their own destiny. And a lot of the regulation that's put in place is to protect the public good from that private self-interest. And so it is an extraction. But in order to get a meaningful extraction that actually contributes to the public good, there needs to be a balance between providing for that self-interest in a way that also solves for the public good. So the inverse of the question of show me a great public place where this has worked, I can point to 1,000 bad public places where this hasn't worked. And it doesn't work when regulations are universally applied and they're applied draconianly. So if you can look at retail all across many cities in which retail as an amenity is an extraction and is required, and it doesn't work because it's instituted in a universal way that is not appropriately planned. So you point to the waterfront, which I do agree is a public amenity that we should all be able to enjoy. You can go to Vancouver and look how they have dealt with the public waterfront. You can look at what we've done on the Charles River. And by creating that public amenity, it does enhance land values. Wholeheartedly agree. I think, however, when you look at those situations and say, that's the way to do it and we have to do it everywhere and always has to be like that, is when we begin to run afoul. Mm-hmm. And it is an extraction, but it should be one that creates value for all parties involved.
Right. I mean, this wouldn't be happening as often as it is if it didn't somehow work for all the parties involved, right? There's a reason why we do it this way. Mm-hmm. And that's a little bit of what I'm trying to get to is, why do we do it this way at all?
Well, I think it's a complex question. I'd like to speak to Chapter 91 directly. I mean, there's underlying public rights that go back to colonial times along the waterfront. But what's really interesting, and that's what I had noted in my article about this, having done a lot of work along Massachusetts waterfront in Chapter 91, is those rights are not nearly as black and white as they're often understood. Right. The fact of the matter is we've got public rights that are very extensive where there's water or has been water in the past, and the private sector has rights on the upland side, but there's an intermediate zone where the private really does have quite a few rights, and where the public has some rights to access and use, which have been dramatically reinterpreted from what their original purposes were. Having said that, the waterfront is in effect a negotiated place, and there are a range of rights and there are a range of different kinds of spaces get created. And I think that part of the challenge is, if you think about this as being not an exaction, but call it a tax. It's a tax to create a shared benefit that's targeted to specific projects that are moving at that time. One of the things that's a challenge is trying to understand how to evaluate the benefit. Parks and open space, public space is one of those things that seems to be on the side of the angels. It's good, but it's not universally good. The design, who is actually using it, the design of it gets to be incredibly important. So one of the things that I keep finding comes back in the conversation is, I understand where the money comes from and why, but is it going, to your point, is it going to something that is truly a reasonable benefit for the community?
Right.
Yeah, I don't think it's terribly useful to call it an extraction, a tax, an exaction, because we're dealing actually with very ambiguous property rights that belong to both the public and the private. I mean, there are lots of examples around the United States and around the world where, in fact, public spaces are procured through something called incentive zoning, which is deemed by everybody to be completely voluntary. The developer has a right to build at an as-of-right density, whether that's 15 floor area ratios, the technical language of zoning experts. If she would like to build a larger building, in order to make more money, she's welcome to apply to the city to ask for extra density. If, in return, voluntarily, she provides a plaza, an arcade, or other outdoor or indoor space. Nobody normally refers to that as a requirement. On the other hand, there are other situations where the technical legal language is of exactions. That is to say, as a condition for development approval, you must provide this, you must provide that. Now, by the way, this is not necessarily or axiomatically onerous. For example, if a developer is building 100 units of housing and creating extra car trips out of that, then it's reasonable to say, would you please address that by expanding the road? And I think most people would agree with that. On the other hand, if you asked for an 8-lane superhighway that ran for 5 miles, most people would say 100 car trips, that's excessive, and that's, by the way, going to be unconstitutional. Now we get to the waterfront of Boston. What really are the private property rights? Not fully clear always. What are
The line is a little
rights?
blurry.
The line is a little blurry. And that's the problem of characterization. So I understand, by the way, that a private-oriented person on this panel would say it's an extraction. I get that, an exaction. You know, that's why some of us are bald or have gray hair or whatever. You know, on the other hand, on the other side, there's no, actually, you know, you're getting a larger building. Vivian started with that. Who knows? Maybe your building is larger than it otherwise would have been. So
Yeah, but that's not,
at the end of the day,
that's not entirely true.
Well, turn to Vivian.
So, I mean, those are not necessarily exactly correlated the way you're describing it. It's not that because I built a park or because I invested $3.5 million into a park on the Mystic River that I therefore was able to get additional density. So those, in certain instances, that may be true if the zoning is characterized that way, but in most instances, that is not true.
So what's the developer's motivation for doing it then? Because it's required as a condition of approval?
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of motivations for doing it, right? One is, our motivation for doing it is because we were trying to create a better front door that happened to overlap with a great public space and a great public amenity. There are times when what is being asked of a private developer for them to do does not necessarily correlate to something, A, that's good for them, or B, that may be good for the public. And that's where sometimes zoning, regulations, et cetera, get out of skew with the realities of current situations. You'd ask the question, why is it this way? It's this way because we, as Americans, are unwilling to tax ourselves sufficiently for the public entities to do what they need to do to create these public spaces.
Right.
And so what we've done is we've created vehicles for ourselves in which to get those done. And what we've decided is that, to your point, enhanced real estate value essentially is going to pay for that. Because I can build something here, I'm generating additional real estate value, and a portion of that profit should go towards building some form of amenity or public space. Right. It's no different than if we were to say, let's take all of the land within a half mile of a T-stop and let's decide to put a surtax on that half mile of the T-stop to pay for and underwrite the funding of operating the T-stop, such that the value add associated with being close to a T-stop has some correlation to the value add of operating that T-stop regularly. There's a similarity in this. And in those instances, when we look at it in pure theory and very theoretically, it works just great. But in reality, there's a whole host of pragmatic issues that come up when we mix theory with reality that don't work.
Well, I'm just so proud to live in Massachusetts because I think we have extraordinary opportunities of where it does work. You know, and maybe because I've been at the Harbor Association now a little bit more than 2 decades, I found it ironic to watch the video because Judge Woodlock was actually one of those who had major reservations when we talked about, you know, the open spaces and such
Well, about
outside.
whether the federal courthouse would be subject to Chapter 91 at all. Yeah.
Exactly. And in fact, they're not subject to Chapter 91. The way
So
they
those
couched
were
it
all-
was,
right.
we have decided voluntarily, because we are the federal government. Vivian, you remember how the Constitution works. Federal government, you know, takes precedence over state and city requirements. We're voluntarily agreeing to the spirit of Chapter 91. So, you know, but over a period of time, as we have seen, you know, whether it was Ed Sidman at Rose Wharf, whether it's Judge Woodlock at the courthouse, over time we have seen that the way the Chapter 91 program has been administered, so well done, that the benefits, the developers, frankly, at this point, are very enthusiastic. I actually get calls from developers. Vivian, you're about to write a comment letter on such and such a property next to mine. You're going to make him do it as well, right? You're going to make him do it. Absolutely, Judge, so, or whomever. Good, because we had to do it. We like now what we see, and darn it, we don't want him to not have to do it because then it's not going to be as attractive.
I'm the one who's asking you to write the
Yes,
letter,
yes, yes,
not
yes,
the
yes.
one who's not willing to do it.
No, you're not the one. You're not the one. And in fact, you've done a wonderful job where you are, and I like the water transportation feature as well. But, you know, I think when we look at it over a period of time, it was frankly like the cleanup of Boston Harbor. No one wanted to pay for the cleanup of Harbor. I mean, you know, the commercial interest says, oh, why do we have to pay for that? And yet now everyone celebrates the cleanup of the harbor. Everyone celebrates the cleanup of the harbor. They celebrate having a harbor walk. There isn't a property owner who says, I don't like the harbor walk. They love the harbor walk.
Okay, so what's wrong with this then? This is great. Everybody wins, right?
It's wonderful.
I'm a taxpayer. My tax dollars don't have to be spent for this. We know public budgets are thin anyway. Private parties are building this. Developers are good at building things and maintaining things. They're not, you know, burdened by all these very progressive reforms about competitive bidding and civil service and so on. They can be very efficient, right? And deliver these spaces. I'm sorry, we'll get some comment here. You know, they're happy to do it when it enhances the value of their property and entitles them to an approval that they might not otherwise get, especially on the water, where, as Gerald says, their rights are a little blurry to begin with. So to establish the right to build in areas subject to the public trust, you know, you're expected to, so fine, I now have established the right to build a valuable project. In a way, everybody wins. It works for the public sector, right, because it relieves the burden on them of having to produce this. It certainly works for the taxpayer. In not all the time, as Don has pointed out, but when it does work, it works for the developer. So what's wrong with this? What are we so nervous about? Who's being left out of the equation here, whose interests are not being served? Gerald, start. You've written on this.
First of all, you haven't heard Don. I happen to disagree with him as he characterized development, but he is complaining. So I think it's fair to say he is complaining, and that's an argument that a lot of developers and owners make.
Is he complaining, or is he saying just don't take for granted that it always works?
Well, he's also saying it was required on me, it took away from my property rights. I think in certain areas that's true. I don't happen to agree in the Chapter 91 area it's true because of this blurred private property rights issue, and we can talk about it. But it is true in some cases. Let me make another point, though, that I do think is interesting about these kinds of public spaces. It's a separate point, and it's this issue, well, why wouldn't the public sector do this? How is the public sector going to provide hundreds and hundreds of these smallish kinds of spaces on private property? quite frankly, that would be a very hellish kind of operation. It's one thing to provide large parks, and as we know now, the budgets are very, very stretched to even do that. So of course, this was viewed to some degree as a turn away from public money. We were simply not willing to spend the tax dollars that Don referenced on this kind of thing. Maybe we should do more on parks. So we get Central Park Conservancy or Friends of, you know, any park anywhere, et cetera. But for these smallish kinds of things scattered about, I would say from a physical planning point of view, and this is something, Steve, that you might address, it's very, very hard to imagine the public sector creating 500 or 100 or 50
Surely,
of these smallish kinds of things.
So let's go to Steve on that. But your premise is that these small parks are good, and that if you had a planning process, so isn't that part of the issue with exactions, is that the open space ends up being very opportunistic. It happens where development happens, not necessarily where open space is needed. If you did a planning process, would you have, the Harbor Walk's an exception to that. That has a clear planning rationale. But all the small spaces you're talking about, if you actually started out with an open space plan, is that what that would result in, or would you more likely have a smaller number of larger open spaces?
No, that is not how it should result. In fact, a lot of what happens.
Steve, I'm going to give you a chance.
I'm sorry, Steve.
No,
a lot of what happens when everybody has to provide their little itty-bitty park on the corner is that the city wall and the fabric of the city loses its continuity. And so if everybody has to provide a corner park with a fountain or a statue in it, then what you have is a whole series of corner parks and fountains and statues, and not city walls, and not retail environments, and not great streets, and not the fabric of a city that has continuity, that provides both compression and relief when you get to the larger open spaces. So that is the truth. When we universally apply these standards and these requirements, then you're going to get universal mediocrity. And part of the challenge that you had raised is how does this not work? If it doesn't deal with flexibility, and it doesn't deal with the realities and the pragmatic situations that occur, then there's a problem. And I'll go into one example. Working on a project down in DC, we recrafted what's called a CR zone. And it's an incentive zone in which where we started with the planning board, and this was a 6-month discussion between myself and the chairman about how do you make sure that a 330-acre new central business district is going to provide all of these amenities without requiring every single landowner to provide every single amenity. And so what we came up with was a laundry list of incentives in which if you provide X or Y and Z, you got some small increment. And so each individual landowner could choose to provide from that menu a variety, or 1 or 2. They could provide a library, they could provide a park, they could provide affordable housing, they could have incentive density because they're close to transit, but they didn't do all of it. And it left open for the planning board to move those incentives for various priorities based on where we were in the development cycle. So if a library hadn't actually been built yet, and that was something that everybody wanted to do, they could boost those incentives and get that done. That's what's missing in blatant, sound regulation.
All right, so I want to give Steve a chance here. So Steve, Steve, let me frame this a little for you.
Okay.
You've followed the municipal harbor planning process.
Right.
That, in a theory, that's sort of a vehicle for this, right? When you do,
right.
you do a plan for a section
Yep.
Of the waterfront, there's an open space component to that plan. As it happens, the way Chapter 91 works is you get into this discussion of substitutions and offsets, of basically exactions that are parcel by parcel. Does it work or does it not work? Is there enough planning going on, or is this too opportunistic, too episodic?
No, I guess if we were all so wise that we could look into the future and know where the parks ought to be, where the activity centers should be, how things will change, it'd be great if we could have those kinds of master plans. What the Chapter 91 has done is really to set up a negotiating process that works pretty darn well in many ways. And I'd like to preface this by saying, while the private property rights might be fuzzy, the public property rights are also fuzzy. It's a fuzzy world. And it allows for kinds of, and what I find enriching about real cities is the fact that there is complexity in the different kinds of civic spaces and public spaces. So as we think about this in a fuzzy world, what the municipal harbor planning process does in theory is lay out in advance exactly that same kind of list of, gee, you could take one from this list and one from this list, and if you add it up, you get enough benefits. And there's a very, very strange calculus that gets created. And that calculus changes constantly in order to make it seem as though if I get this amount of shadow, how many trips on a boat do I get? It's really funny, but in the end what's happening is that there's a framework that's created in advance because you cannot move ahead with a tall building like this unless the municipal harbor plan is in place. That plan says there's certain things we're going to try to achieve here, and then the property, when it goes through its process, that the result of it is that there's a looking at that plan, a revising that plan, and a solution that's site-specific, and they are all site-specific solutions. The thing that is really a hidden bit of this, and whether it's good or bad is really worth debate, is the amount of time and expense it takes. When I was working on at the time was Russia Wharf, Atlantic Wharf, so we were doing the planning for this project. And the owners at the time, Equity Office, the guys flew in from Chicago and says, how long in the city of Boston, if we wanted to open our doors, given where we were, there was no municipal harbor plan in place. There were a lot of entitlement issues in place. How long would it take? And we calculated out, we said, moving really, really fast, you've got 9 years ahead of you. And it was about 9.5 or 10 years before we got there. And that time frame is really interesting because it allows for a lot of good planning. But from a private sector development standpoint, the cost of that is huge. So we have to create high values because there's no way to develop this waterfront without it being really expensive.
I think, to be fair, the Chapter 91 process obviously does not take 9.5 years.
No,
the whole planning process.
The total process.
Yes, the whole planning process. But I do think if we want to talk about a site very close to here, and I love your site in D.C., Maryland area, how many people know where Anthony's Pier 4 restaurant is? I think everyone in this room, right? We've all been there. That was purchased in December of 2014 by the remainder of that site by Tishman Speyer. They sent people from New York City. They love the site. They love the fact they're going to have a 1 acre park that they're going to build. They're so excited to have us look at their plans. And as you know, the building right next to where they are, the 100 Pier 4 site, is about to have a civic use on the first and the second floor of that. And the RFP has gone out. There were a number of people that came to the briefing session. So yes, it's not a precise science, but I think that what Steve has pointed out, there's flexibility by the Chapter 91 staff. You try as best you can to project out whether it's 2 years, 9 years, 5 years, whatever, and then to say, okay, we're going to have the open space, and what are the inside uses? What type of civic use or cultural use are we going to have in that building? And that's what we're going through right now. And the building obviously has opened. They're trying to figure out what happened on part of the first floor and the second floor. But I think in our state overall, I think we've said overall, it's pretty darn good. I mean, whether it's the regulators, whether it's on the city level, whether it's a not-for-profits. I mean, the fact that we're all so collegial here and we work together
it's really
so well.
Great, Vivian, to see you as a defender of the status quo.
I like what they've done.
Seeing you in.
I think they've done a relatively good job, and I think we should be very proud of what has been done through the Chapter 91 process.
Don't you, that it's true, these waterfront sites are very valuable. Developers wouldn't spend 9 years.
That's right.
Correct.
That's right.
But you have to acknowledge also that the exactions, if you don't like that word.
I don't like that word.
The
amenities, the public
amenities
amenities.
by developers as a condition of approval, and just the time it takes to get there, to negotiate them, put a burden on density, right? And if you think that lower density along the waterfront is a good thing, you sort of can't have it both ways.
No, but look at the sale of properties that have happened. Look at the garage, right, on Melcher Street, and the interest. Look at 315 on A, and look at, in fact, Tishman Speyer for the Pier 4 site was able to attract 2 Chinese insurance companies who have never done business in the United States to come to Boston. To me, that is a sign that the value, in spite of all these things that you talk about, there is significant interest. We do not have blight on this waterfront. If anything, as we see the transactions that occur, and you and others in the real estate community have seen these properties flip and change hands, they don't go down in value. I mean, the fact that Alan Leventhal bought back his property by Channel Center. He sold it to Dick Galvin, has now brought it back as Beacon Capital. It just goes to show that's more valuable.
The Central Boston waterfront, that's true, but Clippership Wharf has had a
That's moving forward, though. But that's moving forward right now.
25 years. So, sometimes, particularly.
Good things are worth waiting for.
Okay, all right, that's good.
Yeah, I'm a little puzzled by this conversation, actually. Because I thought we were going to be talking about public space, private provision, and what we're ending up talking about is a broader conversation about whether it's fair to impose this burden on a private developer. That's a reasonable conversation to have. I'm both a lawyer and an urban planner. I've argued cases, representing both cities and private developers. There are constitutional rights. I just didn't think that was this panel, actually. So I'd like to refocus back, if we could, really, to the idea of providing public space as an amenity, indoor, outdoor, by engaging with the private sector to help in this, and the benefits and the problems that arise from that. And both things actually occur.
Good. That's good.
So Gerald, on that. So, this is right there, we're looking at 360 degrees of this issue. And so maybe now we can depart from the 90 degrees that we've already addressed on development feasibility. I would just point out that if you care about amenities on the waterfront, you have to care about development feasibility, because that's what delivers those amenities.
It won't happen if it's not feasible.
Right. But let's talk, so you've written particularly about, in a different context, not Chapter 91, which we're spending some time on here, and we don't have to confine it to Chapter 91, but in the context of New York's incentive zoning and the fruits of 50 years of incentive zoning in New York, the plazas and public amenities that produced, it wasn't perfect. So tell us a little bit about some of the pitfalls of doing it this way, and if you can apply them. I mean, New York's interesting, but we're more interested in how those insights apply to Boston.
Right. So New York City and many other cities have used incentive zoning, this mechanism where, as I said, zoning concessions are delivered to developers above their baseline as-of-right development potential in order to encourage them to provide a whole series of indoor and outdoor amenities. New York City has been one of the principal practitioners of this and indeed originated the technique, but it's worldwide. So if you go, it's Toronto and Seattle and San Francisco and Los Angeles and Tokyo and Bangkok and Hong Kong and Singapore and Melbourne and Seoul, and we could go everywhere. It's a very, very popular kind of technique to secure these smallish kinds of spaces, the kinds of spaces that a very eminent sociologist named William H. White, Holly White, wrote about in a book called The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces, and a wonderful film to that degree. So New York has obtained, since 1961, about 530 of these privately owned public spaces, representing, if you aggregated it all together, about 10% of Central Park in New York. By the way, developers received, just to throw this in, an extra 16 million square feet of rentable space, office and residential space, in the bargain. All right. Based on a survey that I did with the City of New York and a civic organization in 2000, we found that 41% of the spaces, we used the word marginal. That was just a nice word for useless. So how could that be the case? How could, 4 out of every 10 of these spaces be useless? And the answer was not the developers were the problem. The answer was that the laws that were drafted governing the provision of these spaces were so loose that essentially you slap down some asphalt and you go and collect your zoning bonus. And Don referred to this actually by talking about peppering a street you know, with plaza, plaza, plaza. It didn't work. It's not the way we build cities. Well, you know, 20 years later, the city got wise, changed the laws, and introduced some very good planning. And the spaces that have been provided since 1975 in New York are genuinely an asset for the city. They're not great, but they're definitely an asset for the city.
So what made the difference?
Law. Better law. Now, there are other problems. The one finding was originally that 41...
Better law meaning what?
The laws were amended.
Right,
that's right. So the laws started to require things like, oh my God, seating, landscaping, water elements, and high-quality materials, and seats that worked.
Right. So would you say that is that a pervasive problem on the Boston waterfront of open spaces that don't have seating or that are not designed to a high enough standard? Would that be useful here, do you think?
I have no comment about that. I actually think the spaces are quite good. So I don't have a critique of the spaces themselves. My critique in Boston actually relates to the second finding that I and colleagues in New York made that Boston hasn't been able to do, which is we found that a lot of the spaces weren't provided as they were required to be provided. But we were able to discover that. We found that roughly half of all buildings with a space in New York had an illegal space, privatized. But we were able to determine that because we assembled and had the records of all of these spaces. What I wrote about in Architecture Boston under Renee's excellent tutelage, is an article simply calling for the city of Boston, the state, all of the government officials, coupled with civic organizations and others, to assemble all of the information regarding every single privately owned public space that's been provided so that we have that data as members of the public and we'll know about that wonderful public restroom that was referred to, by the way, in the film, as opposed to only discovering it if we're walking by and desperate to go to the bathroom. Wouldn't it be nice to have a central repository of all that? It would require the public officials to agree to provide all of this legal information that can be analyzed by interested and capable people. And then we have a record of all of these spaces. And I remember calling for this in New York with the chair of city planning in 1998, and several years later we had it. So that would be something that I'd love to have accomplished out of this little discussion that we're all having, et cetera. A small little effort. Yes, that's right. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah, and I'd say that one of the things that's an interesting challenge is to take those spaces that were created, which Holly White would abhor because they really don't have the structure, the location, the design, but they're ours or they're public in a way. We need some guerrilla programming, I think, of a lot of the spaces that we have. We look at pop-up retail in places that aren't working as retail. Now, I think we need to find ways of inhabiting our cities and bringing programming in, and that's the dimension that Boston has done actually an astonishingly good job in addition to other things. That when you, along the waterfront or along the central artery or in other places, increasingly people are saying, okay, here's the space, who's there, when are people there, what can they do, how much is a mac and cheese? It's really interesting how the programming makes all the difference in the world.
So, I'm surprised at how tame this panel is about how
you're
well
not
this
sitting
is all
at
working.
you're not sitting at this end of the table.
Well, but basically, you're making some good suggestions. We need a registry of public spaces. We need to do more programming. Doug says we need to get there a little more quickly and predictably. Vivian loves it. All these great spaces that have been created, and why wouldn't you? You worked hard for for 20, 30 years to realize this. But it still makes us kind of uneasy that private parties are providing these public amenities. Isn't that sort of a little bit of the premise of this panel, that there's unease broadly about whether this is a good idea to be turning this? What happened here? Turning this, I guess the panel's over. Turning this responsibility over to private parties, is that exaggerated? I mean, are we basically saying, if we fix it at the margins, this is the way we ought to be doing it?
Isn't that the bargain that's struck?
Mm-hmm.
If you're asking private developers to pay for it, shouldn't they have a say in what it is? and make sure that what it is also provides some value and some benefit to them in order for them to do it? Isn't that part of the motivation? I mean, that's part of the bargain that's struck. If you're going to cede the creation of public spaces to private entities, then you kind of have to live with some of those outcomes.
I think Gerald's point about the fact that some of these spaces are not being built or operated the way they were permitted is a key issue. So, you know, they may give you the X amount of square footage you don't know about because the signage isn't there, or the doors are locked, or whatever the case is. So I think just building the space in and of itself isn't sufficient. But I'll tell you, generally on the waterfront, if they agree to do it, it's built pretty well. The standards are there because you're not going to have a dumpy open space when you're charging what they're charging for these condos or what they're charging for the rent of the offices. It just doesn't happen that way. I mean, they bring in good landscape architects. I would say, and one of the examples, and I don't know if there's anyone here from Massport, we do love the way they maintain their open spaces. I mean, when you look at what is being done around the city, owned by Massport, and it's ironic to say that about a public agency, but it's very well maintained. And, you know, if that was a standard that everyone followed, I think that'd be terrific.
Yeah, but Vivian, I think I would agree with you on the waterfront, where the values exist to allow developers and, frankly, the marriage of what's good for me is also good for the public actually exists. Yeah. And there is an alignment of interest. But you can go to parts of this city and all cities where those values don't exist, and yet the desire for beneficial open space and or necessary retail to improve street environments is imposed in places where the values don't exist to support it, and therefore corners are cut and or the product that actually gets built doesn't the synergies don't exist. It's easy to point to the waterfront and say that it does because they do. But there are a lot of places that don't.
But the waterfront was never what it was today. 20 years ago, all of us could have bought South Boston's waterfront, pieces of that, right? 25 years ago, we could have bought parts. And Charlestown, East Boston. I mean, we are seeing every single area. Chelsea, when people say to me they have children, they want to invest, I say go to Chelsea now. Go to Everett. Okay, go to East Boston. Because 5 years from now, you're going to kick yourself. All of you here, you're going to kick yourself for not having bought, because it is not going down, it is going up. And that was the story of South Boston, that's the story of Charlestown. There isn't a waterfront neighborhood. And again, it's the waterfront, it's not, I mean, South Boston, right, 20 years ago, when Frank McCourt was buying with Jamie, we could have bought.
I agree with every point that you're making. I agree with every point that you're making, but we're taking advantage of a natural resource, the rivers that exist, that's a limited thing. When you go into inner Chelsea and you ask them to build a park or put up a statue or create an open space, and the value and the reason for it to exist.
Who's moving into Chelsea right now? Who's moving into Chelsea right now?
Okay. Steve.
Well, I'm going to try to insert a point of view here that if we keep talking about the really success story, we can describe why we think the waterfront is so successful. But let's go a little elsewhere. The last time I checked, there were no Fortune 500 corporations in Boston. But if you go to cities where
Liberty Mutual, isn't that the only one?
Maybe it is.
Yeah.
So I shouldn't put that out because I'm going to be corrected right away. But if you go to cities where private sector development is driven by large corporate interests, the difference between the haves and the have-nots and the way public space gets treated is dramatically different. In the model that we have, the economic engine that we have here in Boston doesn't translate. And I can tell you that in cities where they're trying to find they're really trying to do bonusing and doing public space. I won't name the cities, but there are a lot of distressed cities in the Northeast that there is no feasible redevelopment at all, and they're writing these zoning codes for towers that will never happen to create spaces that will never occur. And those cities are losing out on a rich civic life. And they're the have-not cities in that way as well. But I remember in Cincinnati, Procter & Gamble was building a new headquarters space, and they, as part of their deal, they did a huge public open space, which is the best front doormat for a corporate office I've ever seen, but it is not a place for people to enjoy, gather, or a civic space in the city. And that's far more the challenge that I see, where in reality what's happening is a kind of, it's public, but it's really ours. It's really not for you, it's really for us. And when that starts to become a driver in cities, the cities Houston, Dallas, if you walk around Dallas and look at that open space, I mean, it's just got different people, fingerprints are on those spaces, and you've got to go find the real life civic spaces in other parts of the city. So I don't think we've got an exportable commodity in a way, or an exportable model as well as it's been successful here.
Well, let me take one part of that, Steve, and we only have a couple of minutes left, so I want to pivot a little bit by asking a philosophical question. You know, rather than comparing Boston to elsewhere, part of the beginning of your comment was about different parts of Boston. Isn't, you know, one of the issues with, Vivian, you're extolling the virtues of these very high quality waterfront spaces. We have very high quality space where we have very valuable land. And since we tie that space to the development that generates it, in neighborhoods that have less high value land, there's no resource for that open space. And the public sector's ability to deliver that space starts to atrophy a little bit because we're putting the burden on developers to do this. Are we creating sort of parallel systems of, we have great high quality open space where we have a lot of development pressure, and we have not so good open space in other neighborhoods?
Yeah, and the answer is absolutely. Yes. That's of course what happens, and that's why there are these huge equity debates. That's what Mayor de Blasio talked about when he ran for office. That's what he's trying to do with Central Park getting $100 million on the one hand, and neighborhood parks getting nothing. So there have been a lot of proposals to address inequality. And by the way, this is one.
Would you have like a linkage?
Yeah, so absolutely. So there's a state representative proposed a bill that said if you contribute to the Central Park Conservancy in New York, which pays for improving Central Park, some percentage of that money will be taken off, literally removed, and will go to neighborhood parks. And it's very, very controversial because the Central Park people say, well, then they'll stop contributing to Central Park. But of course, we have all sorts of redistributive types of programs, and this is the argument that we have today, whether it's about parks or housing, it's an inequality question. So yes, if you're going to use the market to provide certain kinds of things, then it's not going to work where there's no market. And it's a huge problem with incentive zoning, which leads to no plazas in Bedford-Stuyvesant or Harlem, and you have all the plazas in the rich areas. So it does require thinking through other kinds of mechanisms to guarantee some degree of justice and fairness.
Well, I agree with you 100% that that is the way to solve it. I don't know how you do that. I mean, you're talking about private donation towards something that they have to do that has a direct correlation to the property on which they sit. And now you're saying, well, we're going to use now that vehicle as a broader distribution to solve for social equity concerns. So I don't see how that, I don't know how that works.
So I can, at least if you do, I have another minute or two on this, look at what, the mayor of New York has proposed, Don. He said, I know where the money is. The money is in development. I want to develop 200,000 units of affordable housing over the next 10 years. And by the way, it could be 30 parks, except he's less interested in parks, although he remains to some degree interested in parks and redistribution. I want 200,000 units of affordable housing. How am I going to get them? I'm going to upzone great parts of Manhattan and Brooklyn and Queens, allow developers to make more money than they otherwise would have made. In other words, across the board incentive zoning, and that money will then fund the affordable housing. And that's what he's doing. So he recognizes that there is power in the marketplace. He recognizes that in order to do this, finally, you have to allow developers to make more money. And you could do the same type of thing if you wanted to with parks, but you're absolutely
it's still a type of exaction, though, right?
Yeah. That's why
I actually don't think that's an exaction. What he's describing, I don't think is an exaction. What he's describing, if truly it is an incremental set of density that has value, and you're taking a piece of that value and you're contributing it to some public effort, then it's probably not an exaction. But those sorts of rules and laws are few and far between.
And what happens when you have you're in the down part of the development cycle?
Then it doesn't.
Any open space?
Then the social equity issues don't get solved.
So let me just ask, is it Oliver Wendell Holmes who said, taxes are the price of civilization? Are we ever going to go back to the world where we just tax ourselves and do this in a way that...
These are taxes.
Pardon?
These are taxes.
Oh, except that they're very...
They're tariffs.
Pardon?
They're tariffs.
No, they're not generally applicable. I mean, they're taxes on specific, right? We look for opportunities to harness development to pay for these public benefits. In a way, fine, everybody wins. But we've talked about all these issues that it presents, including especially the equity issue that I don't think we have a complete solution for. Some of the others you could fix at the margins. That's not an easy one to fix. Are we ever going to go back to this world of just, a property tax surcharge for open space? Could you imagine that?
No.
A citywide, property tax surcharge for increased open space?
Well, one thing I think we have to be careful that in looking back, it's not like that ever really existed very much. We never have spent a lot of money building expensive public open space if it wasn't opportunistic. The Olmsted parks were built in places that were swamps and difficult to use. We find places and opportunities for it, but there is, I think, a model that I think was fantastic. So back in the late 60s in Seattle, a group of civic leaders said, we need to have a regional park system, we need to have a regional transportation system, and it's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to cost $500 million, which actually was a lot of money then. It's actually a lot of money now. And they did a bond on a county basis and said, we need $500 million to do these things. And darn if it didn't pass by a ton of money. But what we don't have is the political courage today to step up and do that. Even then, and it wasn't it wasn't the Seattle, the place we think of today. That was a different era. And it worked like crazy. So I think it really is possible, but it takes a kind of vision about what that's going to be and a kind of political commitment that I'm finding hard to see.
Right. So I know, thank you, all of you, and over to Renee for some audience questions.
On that note, I think it's just really well said, and I just wanted to say I particularly liked hearing Don talk about, he who pays the piper calls the tune, because that's really a little bit of what we're talking about here too. I mean, that if the private property owners are providing the money and the funding, then shouldn't they have a role in designing, what is built and what will benefit their own properties? Or it makes me think about the Olympics, which I think part of the problem that the Olympics is having in Boston is that people feel like someone else is planning it for them. People who are planning it for them are the people who are going to be paying for it. So, I think that opens up a whole lot of possibilities, and we're going to go to questions from the audience. Ron.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Vivian,
do you want a microphone? Do people need them? Oh, I'm sorry.
It's the thing you're holding.
Yeah, I think there were two. I'm sorry. Go on.
Vivian, you referenced that 100 Fan Pier and the 2 stories that are supposed to be a destination, a civic destination. I was at that same.
This is the Anthony's site.
Because somebody in the audience referred to it as remnant space, and that is precisely what it was. So it's wonderful to say that whether it's Chapter 91 or whatever, yes, we are going to be doing this, but the process by which that was designated, I think, was virtually non-existent. I think it was the developer who said, all right, whatever is left over, and there's, it's a ceiling height of maybe 6 feet. That's supposed to be a performance space. I have no clue as to what they were thinking, and it calls into question, the way the developer, with all due respect, is even thinking about the park, and certainly the way the developer is thinking about this. So there is an issue of process. It's one thing to have the laws that, stipulate that you need to do X, Y, and Z, but then the process by which you do that needs very, very, it seems to me, very careful attention. And I know you had a different attitude toward that than
No, and I agree with you. And in fact, it goes to Gerald's point about people not following what the regulations say. So in that space, it's true. You should know that the open space is actually going to be built by a different developer. So that the building that we were in is UDR, which is out of Denver. Tishman Speyer is actually doing the rest of the site, which will include the park. So, but I absolutely agree with you, and it goes back to his point about the fact that people don't do what they're supposed to do. And you were saying what percent was actually not complied with in New York? 40%?
50% of all buildings with a space or spaces had a space or spaces out of compliance with applicable legal requirements.
Yeah. Wow. So.
Steve, way back there. Thank you.
Hi, my head is spinning a little bit from this discussion. I'm glad you're all talking about this issue. First of all, it's wrong to say that it's cookie cutter and universal. A city can file a municipal harbor plan to identify a discrete area and have a select set of principles for that area. And that's what Boston did at Fan Pier, municipal harbor plan. Here at Atlantic Wharf, separate municipal harbor plan. Over here at GR Faro Project, another municipal harbor plan. And where you are, if your city's enlightened enough, they'll do a municipal harbor plan. So it's not a cookie cutter thing. That's right. Second of all, Chapter 91 exists because the public had a right to the Boston Harbor. That's why it exists. We had a right to it. And we said you can fill it, but you need to preserve public access to it. So it's not exactly private rights, private property. We own it, we let you use it for private purposes, and we want to use it for our purposes. Lastly, I think in the city of Boston, we shoot really low. We listen to these developers and architects generally on a local level, local architects, local developers who shoot really low, and you can see hardship about architecture, hardship about they need to get all the massing out of every square inch because it's hardship. It's the most beautiful waterfront on the entire eastern seaboard, and we hear about hardship in every single conversation. And here we are in Chapter 91, the opportunity to create interior spaces and exterior spaces. And I'm not going to give a speech, I'm just going to talk one or two more minutes.
No.
Okay.
1 or 2 more seconds.
I've been involved in this issue for 18 years now, and commenting, and with Vivian. This room is a Chapter 91 space.
Right.
That lobby, Waterfront Square, it's a lobby, it's a corporate lobby, was qualified as a civic, cultural space. And this building sets a high bar for Chapter 91. If you go down the harbor here, you'll find remnant room after observation deck unused, after ferry terminal, kiosk, whatever. And the reason is very simple. We are aiming really low in the city of Boston, and the state at Mass DEP, at the state level, they're aiming really high. When you look at their decisions, they're saying that the city of Boston should be amassing civic and cultural organizations into advisory groups to talk about how to utilize these spaces, how to engage the civic and cultural community. This is why I wanted to do this. The BRA and the developers are running the show, and the BRA gets the project and developer, and they are 1 million remnant spaces. So my last comment here is, we can be doing a lot better. It's upon the BRA to engage the cultural community. The state said to the BRA in the decision on the municipal harbor plan, you need to get an advisory group of civic cultural leaders. The BRA amended it and put together what they call the Fort Point Operations Board. The Fort Point Operations Board is a real estate professional. It has to be from one of the abutters, a BRA person and a state person, and they make all the decisions. So instead of having this civic cultural advisory board, that's who makes decisions. And then you have a waterfront advisory committee for the municipal harbor plan, the drafting of this entire plan. There's not one cultural representative on the entire waterfront committee, not one. Okay, and there's 20, I think there's 20 or 30 people on that committee. They're all real estate people, developers, and so on. So anyways, I will make a point. I know,
can we share the wealth a little bit?
Oh,
so I think that's all right.
Really
Thanks. All right, thank you. That's good. Passion's good. We like passion. Anne.
My name is Ann Hirschfang, and I'm with Walk Boston, which is a pedestrian advocacy group, the nation's first and still the best. And looking back on my career in transportation, et cetera, and based on the wonderful conversation you've had here, I realized that when I was on the Massport board, it was us who determined that the East Boston Piers would be a park. We specifically required that against the oncoming governorship of Ed King, some sort of legal requirement. We also gave the Belle Isle Marsh to the state for a park. I happened to be on the Executive Office of Transportation in 1982-83 in that transition, when I think that may have been when Chapter 91 was passed, or there was some very important law of that sort passed.
The regulations, yeah.
Regulation, and at that point was when Rose Wharf changed from its original plan, just in a few months, to this new plan, which is publicly accessible. In order, they weren't required to because they came before the legislation, but they didn't want to get caught up in the hurrah about it. And finally, Walk Boston is responsible for the Rose Kennedy Greenway being the lovely place it is. But in any case, I came to talk about Mr. Caden's book in New York. I read about New York. I read it when it was published. I walked around New York and looked at the sites that you mentioned, and it was just eye-opening. Subsequently, somebody who did Post Office Square Park pointed out to me that the building, I think, is at the end of Congress Street on the out-of-town side, was required to have a public space up at the top. And so I went over to look at that. And for one thing, nobody, people down below didn't know it was. And when I went up, it was used for miscellaneous storage. It had absolutely no public purpose at all. So I have been hoping all of this time that the Graduate School of Design, the City of Boston, or MIT, or the BSA, or somebody would do the same kind of collection of information about the public space promises in Boston that have been made and not kept. So I hope that will happen. And one of my prime examples that has come up ever since 9/11 is the Hancock Building.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Everybody I know has been trying to find the agreement that there sure exists that the Hancock was required to have public space at the top, which they have now closed. That would be my first research.
Thank you. Tom Palmer.
Good evening, I'm Tom Palmer. Matt, you asked what's wrong with this equation, and back when I was a reporter, I asked that of everybody I could think of. And developers and some others too told me when there is so much extracted, when it's so expensive for good things, or things that sometimes don't turn out well, but presumably good things, it comes out of somewhere. The developers are not nonprofits, so very often it comes out of architecture. And it comes out of, that is not just architecture, design, aesthetics, materials. And I don't know whether that's true or not, but a lot of people thought that was true. That was what I was told, and I just welcome some comments on it up there.
Yeah, we have a room full of architects here, maybe, or some. Is there any truth to that? Is our architecture not distinguished because of too much extraction?
Again, having been involved in some of these projects on the teams on the private sector side, maybe we were lucky in the architects, which were not us, but others, were very good at negotiating. But no, I don't think that's the link. I think if you look at the total cost of a project, the architecture is such a small component of a development along a waterfront. The premiums are huge with foundations, huge with constructability. Building on waterfronts are really, really tough. That I don't think that's where what's happening more is that they have to wait till the market will actually support the development in order to make it go, that they can get the rents or the sales value that high in order to make the thing go. But I don't think design's being compromised. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong.
Soe?
Thrust of my comment. My comment is, if somebody who's done, as I've done, maybe 3,000 housing units, including on the waterfront across from Christopher Columbus Park, with balconies, with things that HUD said you can't do. In the days that I worked on things, it's a question of both the skill and the tenacity, to use the expression, the balls of the architect and his ability to work with a developer, because developers have to make profits, no question about it. So you have to be very clever, innovative, you have to deal with the community to get sometimes community support. etc. So that's my answer to that, but that's not the thrust of my comments. My comments really relate to, I directed the downtown waterfront Faneuil Hall project from basically 1960 to 64. And what happened is we actually created a plan, and one of the things that's unfortunately happened, especially over the last maybe 20 years, maybe more, is we've really not had planning at the BRA level. That doesn't disparage the people who work there. It just happens that the nature of the government that we have in Boston, I'm talking about, which is a city that I love like all of you, is that the executive, which in this case is the mayor, has an awful lot to say about what develops, how it develops, et cetera, et cetera. So when we did the waterfront project back in 60 through 64, this economy and this waterfront was much different than what you see out here. There was no economy. Nobody was building housing, et cetera. Nobody was building anything on the waterfront. Yet we created a park, it's now called Christopher Columbus Park, that was done with city money. So one of the concerns that I have is if we go to Europe and we look at a city like Paris, some of us know it and love it, it's a city that's beautiful, and not only beautiful, but the streets are active, etc. Why is that? That's because they use taxpayer money as well as planning to create spaces that they believe, and those spaces essentially work. What we've not done is we tend to focus only on the private developer, and I'm not criticizing the private developer. I'm just saying that whether you want to call them extractions or not, we'd be a hell of a lot better off if we provided taxpayer, that same extraction that you're paying, okay, should go into essentially taxes, okay, or whatever you want, tariffs, whatever you want to call it, so that in fact we could create the parks, not only just on the downtown waterfront, but in the neighborhoods that are bereft of those kind of things, so that to make cities really alive, and that's one of the things that is so incredibly wonderful about New York, and to some degree San Francisco, maybe Seattle, and a little bit of Boston. I mean, we tend to wax with all due. I go to Tribeca or wherever I want to go in New York, you'll find people from all of the neighborhoods coming to sit on the seats, watch the free movie, etc., etc. So we need to be very careful if we care about these kind of amenities, not only downtown, but in the neighborhoods, then we ought to rethink the issue of how we collect, if you want to use that term, the funds to do the kind of things and to do the kind of planning. Not that planning's perfect, and I don't mean planning, two architects and one planner sitting down and planning. I mean involving the community, the neighborhood, etc. Not necessarily to give them the worst, lowest denominator of what can be done, but to help by inspiring them and providing alternatives that they can really participate in. And don't put on the capital A badge, I'm an architect and you're a housewife and what the hell do you know? Lots of housewives know a hell of a lot more than architects.
So it's a revolution.
Hello, my name is Ana Maria Carvajal, and I have a question for the entire panel. My question is regarding the use of space, and it's between civic manifestations and cultural events. We saw what happened in Baltimore with the manifestations, and you talked about fuzzy borderlands. So in the eye of violence, or in the eye of disaster risk management, when there is an overflow of damage, my question is about your expertise in the options, in the opportunities, and how to deal with the violence and the misuse of this public space.
Okay, I think the question is about public space as a focus for public protest?
Proper use, purpose, proposing how to retain the ownership of the space, or how to maintain, or how to defend, enclose, and how to take care of the property once it had been given as a cession to the city.
Maintenance and protection of these public spaces.
Okay, please.
Thank you.
I'm going to make an attempt to answer your question probably differently than you're asking it. I think that the great public spaces exist and they are maintained because communities embrace them and they own them. So if you create places where people want to live and they have a sense of ownership of the park down the street or the sidewalk that sits in front of their apartment building, or, I mean, you go back to what Jane Jacobs wrote, right? It's the shopkeeper and the housewife and the children who play in the park. And if you have a sense of ownership about the community in which you live, I think there was a viral video of the mom who went down and grabbed her son and
Yes.
beat him in front of the camera because that was her neighborhood. And her son was destroying her neighborhood. And if we don't create, and it's not really about how we maintain our public space, it's about the communities we build and how we maintain our own communities. And that's what's going to foster safety and caring and maintenance. So it's really about comprehensive community building. That's how I would address the issue.
Have you thought about running for public office?
No.
I think we have time for one question. I think I'll ask Marie, and then I thought we would just very quickly, everybody could get a last word here on the panel, and then it's time to eat. Thank you.
Marie Sorensen with Sorensen Partners, Architects and Planners, and the AV Ed Board. I wanted to mention, per Matthew's earlier point, I've studied the history and development of Buenos Aires, and I noticed in that city that private development would concentrate in certain areas where it was profitable, and the public infrastructure, the primary definitive infrastructure provided by the public being roads and piers, would follow. So just jumping points though, I really appreciated the discussion that Don raised about compression and expansion. And I think that the waterfront is an easy target for public space. Several colleagues of mine and I at UC Berkeley studied the waterfront parks in San Francisco and found that people enjoy the nature and the livability and the civic experience of the Embarcadero just as much as Crissy Field, even though there's more beach and more opportunities to play and more trees at Crissy Field. So it's really just the pure water and the expansiveness and the ability to see waves and seagulls and the visibility of air that makes people enjoy it. So two parks that I'd like to, one park and one lost park that I'd like to draw attention to. You know, let's look at William Penn's plan for Philadelphia. We have the neighborhood, 5 neighborhood parks that are actually big enough that they have trees and probably support ecosystems. You look at Central Park where there's actually trees and there's a sense of a field. So Franklin Park in Boston is a totally underdeveloped resource. There's a huge golf course sitting in the center of it. We should really put attention on that one. Another development missed opportunity development opportunity that caught my eye with great sadness was on Lowell Street in Somerville. Planned unit development, huge triangular parcel right along the new bikeway greenway. 3 new buildings under construction. 3 brand new buildings, tower in a park, condo buildings, 5 stories, what have you. That could have been a park. Check it out, it's a huge parcel. What we need to do is look through our cities and towns and find the densest regions, like the border of Somerville and Cambridge, and find out where we can put huge, reasonably large-sized parks. More density is allowed when, more density is sustainable when you have the relief of parks.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, how about it? Do we have last words, last thoughts on this? Vivian? Start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you build the spaces so that there's the open spaces and the cultural uses, spaces for cultural and civic uses, then the actual programming of those spaces can then occur and evolve over time, as we've seen at Rose Wharf. If they're not built when the construction and development occurs, we will frankly never get it because the land is so valuable. And secondly, as I mentioned, I think if we were to come back 5 years from now, there would continue to be parts of this region along the waterfront, which today we might not think about as, quote, valuable or as its best use. I think we would come back 5 years from now, we would be very impressed with what we will see there.
Don? I don't know how you can follow that beautiful thing you said a minute ago, but.
I mean, I think I've expressed my point of view. Take it or leave it, I think. I do believe that the framework in which we're operating isn't going to change. I do believe that, you know, as private developers, we do have a responsibility, but we also have a selfish interest. And, you know, real beauty and success lies where those two things overlap. And that's just the reality of how our system works.
Harold?
Just two very quick points. I think when one relies on a private market mechanism to produce public space, we always have to keep in mind that it doesn't work in poorer neighborhoods where those market forces don't exist. So we always need to keep in mind the equity issue here to guarantee that neighborhoods that equally desire, need, and should have wonderful public spaces get them, and we need to develop those sorts of mechanisms. The other thing, I would just second what Ann said, which was seconding what I said, which is, you know, it would be great to sit down and be able to assemble the legal documents to find out whether the observatory at the top of the Hancock is in fact required or not, or to know how many privately owned public spaces, outdoor and indoor, we have in the city of Boston, so that we can begin to use them and understand them and study them and enjoy them.
Great. I think that the topic here, when we talk about public and private, following on that, can be very well thought about when we start thinking about us versus them. And that business of a division between what we are entitled to as public versus private. And that's an edge that's important. But if there's one thing I'd like to suggest is that we need to enrich our vocabulary about this in the same way that we need to enrich our public spaces. Because in fact, what's great about public spaces, it isn't just one kind of space. It's public's spaces. But I think it's a little awkward, right? But if we were saying public's spaces and thinking about all the different populations that can exist, coexist, and layer, that makes for a really rich and interesting city as opposed to a single thing that we're trying to repeat. So maybe I'll try to say public's spaces from now on.
Matt, you want to say something? Go ahead.
I would just say that I think and hope that we might be in a transition, sort of a transition period. Just from this perspective of urban history, we lost our way for a while with cities, the way we made cities, right? And we let cars sort of take them over. And we're lucky that we live in the age when we're getting cities back. And they need a much richer public realm than they have. And I don't think this opportunistic approach that we take is going to work to do that in the end. I think we're going to evolve past it, maybe not to the old world of, the public agency doing it all, but I'd like to suggest a citywide nonprofit that, sort of like the Greenway Conservancy, that has a dedicated public funding stream that is responsible for creating and maintaining a richer public realm, starting with planning rather than with development exactions. I think that's really the way it needs to happen for our city to thrive in the future.
Okay, how about a hand for this really great conversation? Thank you, gentlemen, lady.
So there's this big conduit underground that's as big and wide as a Mack truck can drive through. And so we had all these things that we had to figure out around how to build over it and how to build around it and if we could move it. And so we needed money as developers to actually do that. And so one of the initiatives that the Baker administration is doing through this program is to help municipalities prepare sites for disposition. so that that reduces the cost burden on the developer, and which you then have to actually, you know, because you got to charge for that, right? Like, you can't do that for free. And so to the extent that we can encourage municipalities to think about their public land as a resource, that would be great. We would appreciate that. So.